What is autoethnography? What can autoethnographies achieve or do that other research approaches cannot? And more broadly, how does autoethnography fit within the wider landscape of qualitative methods and methodologies? Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and I'm talking to Dr. Barbara Mitra, Joint Head of Department English Media and Culture and Principal Lecturer in Media and Culture at the University of Worcester, my own stomping ground. Barbara, thank you for joining me. And as someone with expertise in this subject, please, what is autoethnography?
Well, the first thing to say is that there are different types of autoethnography, and autoethnographers vary in their emphasis on auto, the self, the ethno, the culture, and the graphy, the research process. So some describe it as a type of narrative researcher. So it's about placing specific encounters, events, and understandings into a relevant context. So in traditional ethnography, the researcher has to acknowledge their own role in the research and where they stand in relation to that research. So they do that critical reflection. So similarly, autoethnographers do something similar, but they're drawing on their own experiences and locating their own experiences in relation to theory. So that's one kind of view of autoethnography and what it is. I've used it a couple of times in publications. So I have two specific publications that use and draw on autoethnography. And one of the things that really stands out to me is how autoethnography that links to theory can actually impact. So it raises the scholarly voice, in my opinion. So there are criticisms of it, just as there are with traditional research methods. And I'm somebody who likes all research methods, including quantitative, strangely enough, as well as qualitative methods. And I've used a whole range. But for me, I do like the ethnography in terms of the impact that it has. So one of my publications has so many more downloads, so many more people contacting me, the story that resonates, and people can understand it. So it not only speaks to academia, but it also speaks to the average person who might be put off reading an article that uses a lot of technical language as well. So it really does engage people. So one of the things that autoethnography does, it draws on notes, reports, and diaries. So for my autoethnography on bringing up an autistic child, that's what I happened to have kept: diaries, reports, letters from school, everything from professionals that were involved. And so I could draw on all of those to help explore the autoethnography for that publication. So it's not just descriptive, because that's one of the criticisms, is that it's just descriptive, but actually it's about linking it to theory as well. So it does involve that reflection, that introspection, which is personal, but it also kind of pans out to the theory and places those ideas in the context, the wider context. So your question also asked, what can autoethnographies achieve or do that other approaches cannot? And I really think it raises the voices of particularly marginalised groups to tell their stories in an academic context. So it can be innovative, it can be evocative as well, in a way that traditional articles and research might not. So it increases the richness and reflexivity as well, and the authority of the research. So in my article that talks about my child, it's harder to argue with my voice. And in fact, I had professionals contacting me, as well as parents and all sorts of people wanting to engage. So it provoked a huge reaction. So it enriches, I think, the narratives, because it's lived experience, but one that's placed in this academic context that can reveal power relations as well. So I think it's powerful, it's liberating, it's impactful in a way that maybe other academic writing and maybe sometimes research isn't. It also addresses power imbalances. And your third question, which was about how does autoethnography fit within the wider landscape? Well, I was thinking about this and thinking, actually, I like all forms of research, and all forms of research bring something to the table, as it were. They might be different. So for me, I think what autoethnography does is it considers the self, which is sometimes minimized in research. So sometimes we're conditioned or we're meant to be as objective as possible. And sometimes our actual own influence in bringing us to research questions is not acknowledged as much. So for me, one thing that autoethnography does is it acknowledges the personal, but in doing that, it also kind of places it into those theoretical considerations as well. So it doesn't follow the same methods that, say, a focus group or interview might do, or indeed a questionnaire. So, however, I think it gives an insight into someone's critical narrative and then stretches that out to wider cultural theoretical questions in an impactful way. So I know it's been criticised for a lack of being systematic and a lack of rigour, but actually I think it also challenges the boundary of what we should consider knowledge. And for me, that's one of the things that I find time and again in restricted ways of writing. I've done some research with some science-based research, and they have very specific ways of presenting the research findings. And I think what autoethnography does and can do is actually challenge that there is this set way of knowledge, of exploring themes, of exploring knowledge as well. So it challenges this notion of what is objective. In fact, when I did study statistics, one of the first books we read was How to Lie with Statistics. And for me, autoethnography is part of a kind of maybe a tradition that challenges this idea that we can never be entirely objective as well. So I hope that's kind of answered some of your questions.
Barbara, that's really interesting. Thank you. There are lots of things thrown up by what you've said. If I may, I have a question. In addition to presenting historical narratives, autoethnographers attempt to articulate their inner thoughts and feelings, as you've alluded to. Now, of course, facts and values or facts and value judgments will be elided in this endeavour. However, let me ask you about the articulation of thoughts and feelings. Now, these are clearly complex and difficult activities, and some scholars suggest this articulation cannot always be achieved, or it can't be achieved in the straightforward sense that's sometimes assumed. It is not necessarily clear, for example, whether what's articulated is a construction fabricated in the moment or a construction grounded on recall or good enough recall. We might also wonder whether in some, if not all instances, emotions and feelings can be translated into words. Again, to the extent that they can, this translation is probably more convoluted than is commonly supposed. And in thinking about what's occurring, I don't dare open the lid on the problem or question of the stability of identity. However, all of that aside, in what might be termed traditional qualitative interview situations where the problems I've alluded to all remain, perhaps the to and fro of interviewee interaction helps or enables the process of thought and feeling articulation. And thus, while you have clearly sketched the benefits of autoethnography, is something also possibly lost when this approach to investigation is used? Every research method has its limitations as well as its benefits. What would you say?
Well, I would say, I mean, I like methods that use lots of different research methods anyway, because I acknowledge that there's always limitations. However, and it's interesting when you say that feelings can't be articulated always. So some autoethnographers actually use images and visual means of kind of trying to explore those. And I think as well, one other difference that might have come across in the kind of autoethnographies that I've read is that there is quite a long time spent actually trying to articulate and work out, rework those thoughts and feelings as well. In fact, years in some cases. So in the book chapter that I've also got, and the journal article, one happened probably about 7 or 8 years after, drawing on diaries. So the diaries and the reports from, say, school and clinical psychologists were more what you'd call factual, because it was harder to argue. Those were written down, and my responses at the time, emails, etc., written down responses. The other autoethnography I actually wrote with a colleague, and we both were telling the same stories, and we used our stories, our vignettes, to respond to the kind of context that we were in. So in fact, I think we'd had numerous conversations along those lines. And I think those conversations, and then placing it and reading academic literature that also then reinforced those conversations, suggested to us that it wasn't just navel gazing as well.
Okay. I didn't mean to suggest that we can't put our feelings into words. I was just pointing to the self-evident truth that it's very difficult to do so sometimes, and people have suggested that actually we never can quite do that thing, but of course that's a problem faced by all researchers as well. Once again, yeah.
I've got one more thing actually, that I think sometimes I know we're meant to have a really clear hypothesis, etc., and have things nicely panned out, but research isn't always like that. I kind of think research is sometimes quite messy, and I think autoethnography is just part of one of those tools that you can then use. So for me, having used autoethnography has guided me to looking at other things, and I'll use other research methods like thematic analysis or other forms of, say, textual analysis in this instance, to develop some ideas further. So for me, it's almost like a tool, a starting point in my research, but that's just how I am using it. It will remain to be seen whether I go on to use other or use autoethnography for other forms of research that I'm doing.
Yeah, I personally, I tend to think of a research report as essentially an argument rather than a procedural recounting. I mean, it does have an element of procedural recounting in it, but it's not that if we follow the procedure, some sort of truth thing drops out of the bottom. It's more a thoughtful argument that uses a structure of some sort just to give a semblance of coherence to that thing. But I think I'm agreeing with you in a slightly incoherent way. Once again, really interesting. Thinking about this issue, listening to you is making me wonder about the way in which history making in all forms of qualitative interview constructs, and also I think sometimes constrains our self-understandings and our understandings more generally. And I'm reminded here of the work of Carl Loweth, amongst others. Anyway, again, really interesting. Thank you, Barbara. And for those who would like to know or to explore Dr. Mitra's work further, a link will be provided in the notes. Thank you for joining me. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you.